Okay, hi everyone. This is Dr. Kaminsky. This lecture is going to be on chapter 1. Before we get started on chapter 1, I have the Moodle site up, so I just wanted to show you a couple things. So I think some of it may be cut off slightly from the screen, so I apologize for that. I'll also be going over this during our live meetings. Everything for the course is on Moodle. Okay, so one thing I just want to draw your attention to: course syllabus is posted here. You can see some things on here that you wouldn't be able to see that are hidden, but anyway, course syllabus. Um, the chapter 1 lecture is here. What you will also see after I finish this recording is basically a posting that says chapter 1 recorded lecture, and so that would be the actual lecture with my voice going through it. This is just the PowerPoint slides. Okay. One other thing, as you go through every lecture, one thing that I have you guys do is to basically be filling out the exam review sheet as you go through. And then before the exam, the completed review sheet will be submitted, right? It'll be due. And so basically just want to show you in terms of where that review sheet is, you'll usually find it right around when the exam is going to happen. So that's down here in module 5. Okay, so you can see exam 1. Here's the exam 1 review sheet. So it's always a good idea to have that review sheet next to you, either printed out or on your computer screen, where you can just be typing in notes essentially into that review sheet. Okay, and like I said, you'll have an assignment here, right? Picture of completed exam 1 review sheet. It can just be a picture that you take with your phone and you upload because you wrote handwritten notes in it, or it can be a file with typed notes, whatever you prefer. Okay. And so, like I said, good to have that exam review sheet with you. And so, if you just wanted to take a look and see what it looks like, it's just basically an outline, right? And so, super helpful to fill in, definitions and write any notes on here to help you study. And also, obviously, helps you helps to draw attention to those particular areas that are of importance and that will be on the exam. All right, so I just wanted to point that out before I got going with the PowerPoint. All right, so like I said, this is the first chapter, and basically just an introduction, okay, obviously. And so we will, we pretty much follow the textbook pretty closely. And so if you can find a cheap version of the textbook, I recommend getting it. With that said, I provide you with all the information that you need, but sometimes it's nice to be able to read the text just to help clarify information, maybe get a little extra, detail in there that you may need. Okay, so anyway, that's that on the textbook. But you'll see that the PowerPoint slides can come right from the textbook. So if you need clarification, you can go back and read that textbook. All right, so with that said, let's get started. So chapter 1 is called A View of Life. Okay, and so in terms of outline, all right, we'll talk about the characteristics of life, a little bit about evolution and the characteristics of life. And then the last part of the chapter, we talk a little bit about the scientific method. And then usually when we meet for our live class, I'll do some sort of activity involving the scientific method. Okay. And so we'll talk a little bit about that during our live meeting. And then the last part of the chapter talks about challenges facing science. And obviously, this textbook, I forget what version of this textbook when it was published, but those challenges facing science, are sort of ever changing or ever evolving. All right, and so some questions to think about. I don't always put these questions in there at the beginning of every chapter, but I think these are kind of good questions to kind of keep in the back of your mind as you're going through the lecture. So why is evolution a central theme of the biological sciences? Okay, so evolution is a central theme of biology. So think about why as we sort of introduce some of these concepts that we're going to introduce in this chapter. And to be honest, this is a question that you sort of can think about as you go through this entire course. And also the bio113, which is fundamentals of biology too, right? It's always a theme that keeps coming up. In what ways is life interconnected? So just life in general, any living organism, a living cell to a whole living organism, simple single-celled organisms to obviously complex human beings, right? how is all forms of life, or how are all forms of life interconnected? And then the last one, how do scientists use the scientific method to study life? Okay. All right. So let's talk about just characteristics of life. All right. And again, remember, you should have your review sheet next to you, and you should be filling in these notes and adding in what you think is going to be helpful for you to study for the exam. All right. So we're in fundamentals of biology, right? Biology is the scientific study of life. Okay. Bio, life, ology, logy, which is the study of. And so obviously, I'm sure we're all aware that there is a great diversity among living things. I was kind of just saying that. We can think about, a single-celled yeast, which is an entire organism, but just one single cell, to, again, complex human beings. If we think about what living things are composed of, right, some of the same chemical elements as non-living things. They obey the same physical and chemical laws that govern basically everything in the universe. Okay, so all these things are sort of together. Obviously, there's many differences between non-living and living in things, and so that's what we're going to kind of start off talking about. What are the characteristics of living things, right? What makes something living? Even though we said, living things are composed of the same elements as non-living things. Well, what then makes something living versus non-living? It's not just simply what elements it's made up of, okay? So this is just illustrating the diversity of life, right? Showing you bacteria there, right? Single-celled organism. Paramecium, which is, again, another single-celled organism, but this is a eukaryote. Bacteria are prokaryotes. Showing you a fungi, right? Plant. And then obviously an animal there, and actually showing you an octopus there. And so even though we see a lot of diversity as pictured here, there are basic characteristics that all living things share. Okay. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Again, this chapter is very basic, guys, just an introduction. Probably most of this is review. Okay. We should know these characteristics of life. So on the exam, I do ask you them. It's probably, even if you didn't go through and sort of, practice, I don't want to say memorize, you could come up with these properties on your own, a lot of them. Okay. All right. So number one, living things are organized. Okay. And so we talk about levels of biological organization. And so these range from atoms, right, being the most simple, to the biosphere. Okay. And so we're going to talk about that hierarchy. I'll show you a figure in a second. And we talk about the basic unit of structure and function of all living things. It's the cell. Okay. And so, here's something else to sort of keep in mind this whole semester. This semester, Fundamentals of Biology 1 or General Biology 1, wherever you take it, whatever school you take it at, focuses really on the cellular level. Okay. And sometimes I think as we're sort of starting off in our studies as undergrads, we get confused, or we sort of wonder, well, why the heck do I need to know this? Like, I just want to be a physician assistant. Why do I need to know this? Right. Well, it's because the cell is the basic unit of structure and function of all living things. You have to understand what's happening on the cellular level in order to understand a disease process. Okay. In order to treat a patient. And so again, sort of keep that in mind when you sort of, when we're talking about photosynthesis and you start getting really bored, think about why we need to understand these sort of fundamental processes on the cellular level. Okay. That's the basis of function. Okay. So anyway, just wanted to sort of remind you guys of that. And I sort of remind you of that as we move through the semester, probably again when we talk about photosynthesis, because that's one of the chapters that sometimes we have a little trouble identifying with. All right, so it says here unicellular or multicellular, right? I pointed out the bacteria, which are unicellular organisms, obviously multicellular, the octopus, the flower, and obviously ourselves. Okay, and so if we talk about these levels of organization, each level of organization is going to be more complex than the level before it. Okay. And so as we see this complexity increase, you actually see something called a new emergent property. Okay. That basically you see as you move up in complexity. Okay. And so let's go through that here. And so when we talk about the levels of biological organization, it's these. In fact, I'm pretty sure one of your chapter 1 homework questions asks you what the levels of biological organization are. And for the most part, when you talk about them, you're going to talk about most simple to most complex. And so if we start off with most simple, we're talking about atoms. Okay, so the atom, so we should know the level. We should also be able to describe it, right? So an atom is the smallest unit of an element, which is composed of electrons, protons, and neutrons. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about atoms. I believe that's the next chapter. Yeah, in our next chapter. All right, moving up from there, molecule. Okay, so two or more atoms of the same or different elements. So example of an atom here gives you an example of oxygen. If we talk about a molecule, methane. Okay, obviously you can probably think of a bunch of other molecules right now, or a bunch of other examples of atoms as well. Oops, wrong way. All right, next we move up to the cell. Okay, so we said that's the structural and functional unit of all living things. And so what it's showing you here is a nerve cell versus a plant cell. Okay, different cell types, obviously in different organisms. And then if we go up from cells, cells are going to join together. So cells that have a common function and a common structure will join together to form tissues. Okay, so this is showing you this bunch of nerve cells together form nervous tissue. So if we're talking about brain tissue, right, or spinal cord tissue, here, this is showing you a bunch of plant cells joining together to form a specific type of plant tissue. There are many different types of plant tissues, just like there are different types of tissues in our body, right? Nervous tissue being one of them. Probably, again, you probably can think of several other tissue types in your mind. Okay, if we move up from there, now we're talking about organs. Okay, so organs are composed of tissues that function together to perform a specific task. Okay, so obviously, if we're following along the nerve cells here, brain, right? Nervous tissue forms the brain. Okay, sorry to continue on with that little minor interruption. So we're moving from tissues to organs. And so giving an example of the brain, again, I'm sure you can think of 5 other organs in your mind right now. This is actually showing you here, these plant cells together particularly are forming leaf tissue. And then obviously the leaf tissue is going to make up leaves, right? Which you can think of as an organ in plants. Okay. And then next up, we're going to talk about organ systems. Okay, sorry, that's my children who are yelling in the background. All right, so if we go talk about organs, next organ system. Again, brain, part of the nervous system. So you have several organs working together. If we talk about the leaves, part of the shoot system of the plant. Okay? All right, moving on, we have a whole organism now. So it says complex individuals contain organ systems, right? Obviously. So again, we got the leaves, we got the shoot system, and we got the entire tree. We talked about the brain, the nervous system, and now the entire elephant there. Okay, we move up from organism now, population. So what defines a population is organisms of the same species that are in a particular area. Okay, and you can talk about, animal populations, but also plant populations as well. Okay, so again, each one of these obviously is more complex than the next. So most simple to more complex. Let's move on from there. Next, community. Okay, so now these are interacting populations in a particular area, right? So in a community, you have several different populations. So it's showing you here, right? A population of zebras, population of elephants. These are all part of the same community. Okay. Next, ecosystem. So now this is the community, right? Plus that physical environment that exists. And then lastly, it's biosphere, right? So it says regions of the Earth's crust, waters, and atmosphere inhabited by living things. So now you're taking in the atmosphere and the entire, essentially, Earth's crust and adding it to the ecosystem here. Okay, so we should know all of these levels of organization. And again, just a brief description as is outlined here in terms of what each one is. Okay, all right, well, we already did this. Okay, so this is just a little bit more clarification, but pretty much we just talked about all of these and they were just on those last set of slides that we went through. Okay, it says here, and I guess maybe we didn't really mention this because it's not really a level of organization, right? But if we're going to talk about a species, okay, these are similar interbreeding organisms. We talk a lot more about species and speciation at in bio 113, which is fundamentals of biology too. So we sort of get at the end of this semester or the end of this course, we're sort of at the point where the next thing we're going to talk about are different species and how different species form and those types of ideas. So we really don't really sort of cover those concepts until the next course. Okay, all right, we did all this. All right, so this sort of went from most complex down to most simple. Okay, when I described it, we went the other way. All right. So that was all of those levels of biological organization were part of that first characteristic. Sorry to kind of flip back quickly. That first characteristic of life, which we were talking about as living organisms being organized. How are they organized? By these biological levels of organization. Okay. And so that's what we talked about. All right. So for the next characteristic of life, right? Life requires materials and energy. Okay. Again, we probably could come up with these on our own, right? We don't need a textbook maybe to tell us what these are. So energy, what's energy? The capacity to do work. Energy is required to maintain organization, right? And it's required to basically carry out any sort of life-sustaining process, right? Like chemical reactions, okay? You need energy. If there is no energy, there's no living things, right? No way any of the reactions that need to occur in a cell could occur without energy, okay? So another term here, metabolism, it says it is all the chemical reactions that occur in a cell. Sometimes when we hear if I just kind of asked you and I threw out the word metabolism and asked you what does that mean to you, you might say something like, oh, how quick my food is digested, right? Or like something about like sort of burning calories or whatever. I have a fast metabolism versus a slow metabolism. If we're talking about metabolism in reference to a cell, what we're referring to is all of the chemical reactions that occur within that cell. And again, a lot of them require energy. Some will give off energy, right? But energy obviously is a integral component of the chemical reactions that are carried out in the cell. Okay, it says here, the sun is the ultimate source of energy for nearly all life on Earth. So if we think about sort of how life on Earth is interconnected, one thing you might want to think about is the sun and how certain organisms can harvest the energy of the sun, and then how that energy is sort of transferred, right, throughout Earth, essentially, and throughout all the living things that exist. And so, giving you an example of some types of organisms, right, that can perform photosynthesis. So plants, we know, algae, right, some other organisms, there are photosynthetic bacteria that can perform photosynthesis, right? And so we should just know right now basically what is photosynthesis. And so it's a process that's going to convert solar energy into the chemical energy of carbohydrates, right? And so it's solar energy into usable energy, okay? So the plants can actually use that solar energy to make their own food, right? And so that's what we're talking about here. They can make carbohydrates that they use as food. Essentially, they can break those down as an energy source. And then obviously other organisms can eat those carbohydrates as well to generate energy, okay? And so we're sort of continuing on this theme here in terms of this energy flow, all right? So it says also here, so again, we're sort of continuing with this theme in terms of, the solar energy being converted into a carbohydrate and how that then feeds into that entire sort of ecosystem. Okay, so just a couple of things to kind of continue on here. It says chemicals are not used up when organisms die, right? Chemicals will move from one population to another in the food chain. So example, chemicals move from producers like plants that photosynthesize, like we were just talking about, to consumers like animals that eat the plants, to decomposers. I don't know if you can kind of stop, and think about an example of a decomposer in the ecosystem. And so if you can't think about an exact example of a decomposer, you might think about what a decomposer does. And so basically that those decomposers are able to break down organic matter into more simple molecules that then may end up in the soil and then can be taken up by other organisms. Without those decomposers, there would be lots and lots of organic molecules that would be left to waste. Okay, so super important. So there are bacteria that are decomposers, lots of bacteria that are decomposers, but also fungi that are decomposers. Okay, so there are different types of decomposers out there. Okay, so that's what it says. As a result of death and decomposition, like I just said, those chemicals then can be returned to living plants. Again, those plants can then take up those decomposed molecules in the soil. Okay. Again, I think we all can get this part, right? Energy flows from the sun through the plants and to other members of the food chain, just like we mentioned. Okay. And so it says here, therefore, there must be a constant input of solar energy. Again, if we're going to think about this energy flow and how all the organisms in an ecosystem are dependent on that, super important that that initial energy source, the solar energy, is there. Okay. And so this picture basically illustrates what we were just talking about. Okay. Now, sometimes on the exam, I will say, especially since you're going to be taking exams with notes at hand, the textbook at hand, I will ask you some straightforward questions, which are super easy. Usually everyone gets them right. But for the essay questions, I have to ask you more sort of critical thinking type of questions. And so I might put a figure up like this and sort of ask you a question about it in terms of interpreting this, right? Or say, what would happen, if the decomposers weren't here, right? What effect would this have on the ecosystem? So questions like that. So again, just sort of be prepared for those types of questions for the essay questions on the exam. Okay. Instead of me just saying list the characteristics of life, you can just go back to your notes and list it. It doesn't, it doesn't require much understanding. Okay. So most essay questions will be me putting a figure, asking you something specific about that figure. All right. So that's going to be true throughout the whole semester. So this sort of just reminded me of that. So I just wanted to point that out. All right, so like I said, this basically illustrates everything I was just talking about in those last two slides, right? Showing you the solar energy coming in, the role of the producers, the consumers, and the decomposers, and sort of this recycling of chemicals, right? And energy throughout the ecosystem. All right, again, probably something you guys already knew about, right? But we got to sort of again, we're reviewing and sort of focusing in on these important biological concepts, and this is one of them. Okay. Oh, and by the way, another one of the homework questions is to list the characteristics of life. So I'm just making sure you're paying attention to these. I will not when you hand in your homework questions, I don't necessarily go over every single homework question, especially since we're not live. So if you have a question about one of them or didn't understand one of them, it is your job to just ask me, right? So just ask me, in the discussion forum, ask me when we have our live meeting, what have you. But otherwise, I'm just assuming we all were able to find the answers since those questions are super straightforward. So I always in the lecture try to sort of draw attention to them just to make sure I, sort of went over them because sometimes there's just not time set aside to go over these specifically. Okay. So anyway, I already essentially pointed out two of those homework questions, and there's only one more. Okay, moving on. Characteristics of life. So number 3, living organisms maintain homeostasis, right? So we should know what homeostasis is. I'm pretty sure we've probably all heard the word. So it says it's the maintenance of internal conditions within certain boundaries. Okay. So at this time, if we were live in class, I would say, give me an example of something in your body that's regulated via homeostasis, or something in your body that needs to be maintained at a certain level. Okay. And again, so stop, think for a second. Sure, you probably can come up with 1 or 2 examples. Okay. Usually the first one that everyone thinks about is body temperature. Okay. Important that body temperature is maintained, at 37 degrees Celsius. Okay. Why? Enzymes function at that temperature properly. If temperature gets too high, enzymes, which are usually proteins, can denature and therefore not function. Okay. And so That's one example. There's many other examples that you can come up with as well. Hormone levels, right? If you think about any given hormone, right? A hormone like testosterone or estrogen, a hormone like thyroid hormone has to be maintained at a certain level. If there is too much or too little of that hormone, it will have, physiological consequences on, some sort of process in the body. Okay. It says here, feedback systems monitor internal conditions and make adjustments. Again, if we're talking about maintaining body temperature or we're talking about maintaining a hormone level, there are you can think about kind of sensors that detect there's a change from homeostasis, right? Either a level is too high or too low. And then there are mechanisms that will then be activated or initiated to bring those levels back to where they should be. Okay. And it's a constant push pull. So homeostasis isn't just something that's just there. The body has to basically constantly adjust things to maintain homeostasis. Lots and lots of energy is required to maintain homeostasis, right? So it's a very complex process, though it may not seem like it is. All right, so number 4, living organisms respond to stimuli. Okay, they have to be able to respond to stimuli. Stimuli is in the outside environment, but if you think about even stimuli within an organism, right, internal stimuli, if an organism isn't able to do that, it's not going to be able to live, right? It won't stay alive. All right, so it says living things interact with the environment and respond to changes in the environment. Okay, it says the ability to respond often produces movement. So if you think about like simple kind of things or simple organisms that, I don't know, or maybe think about an animal, right? If they see some sort of danger, they're going to move away from that danger, right? Even if you think about a simple, worm, flatworm, like C. elegans or something like that, it basically can move away from aversive stimuli, okay? So that's sort of a kind of simple illustration of this. If you think about one other example for living things to respond to stimuli, if we think about a reflex, right? A spinal reflex. You basically put your finger down on a thumbtack, right? And it pokes your finger. What happens? You pull your hand away, okay? So that's that response. Okay, so it's sort of the easiest way to think about it. All right, number 5, what's another characteristic of life? Living organisms reproduce and develop, okay? Obviously, again, probably something you could come up with on your own. Obviously, living organisms have to have the ability to reproduce in order to maintain the species, to maintain a population. If that doesn't happen, eventually those organisms go away, right? Obviously, there are different types of reproduction. And again, we talk about these probably more in terms of different types of reproduction in Fundamentals of Biology 2, right? Or bio113 when we start to talk about different species. It says here, when organisms reproduce, they pass on copies of their genetic information, right? Or genes to the next generation. Genes determine the characteristics of an organism. Genes are composed of DNA. Okay, again, hopefully something we're familiar with already. And if as we sort of move through this chapter, we're going to talk a little bit about evolution and natural selection. Obviously, this has to do with what type of genetic information is passed on from one generation to another. Okay. All right, number 6, living organisms have adaptations. Again, sort of getting into this idea of evolution, right, and natural selection. So what is an adaptation, right? We should be able to define these terms. It's any modification that makes an organism better able to function in a particular environment, okay? So again, something you can kind of sit and think about for a second in terms of examples of different types of adaptations that exist in animals, okay? I think, yeah, the book gives this example of these penguins here, right? And it actually talks about sort of an adaptation, a behavioral adaptation, what it's showing you there in terms of them being able to slide on the ice, right? The ice exists. They sort of have this slippery kind of surface skin, right, that repels water. They're able to slide pretty efficiently on the ice. If they tried to walk and waddle, that would require a ridiculous amount of energy. And so this is a behavioral adaptation for the penguin, okay? So that's an example there. Again, I'm sure you can think about a whole bunch of other adaptations. Okay, it says the diversity of life exists because over long periods of time, right, organisms respond to changing environments by developing new adaptations. Again, this is natural selection, this is evolution, okay? And so if you want to define evolution, it is a change in a population of organisms over time, okay? And over time, those organisms become more suited for that environment. Okay. And again, what's driving evolution and what drives natural selection are genetic changes, right? So there are certain genetic changes that organisms have that then make them more suited for the environment. Those are the organisms that survive. And those are the organisms that then reproduce. And then again, we have more and more of those organisms that are more suited for the environment. Okay. That's evolution. All right. Okay, so again, this now leads into the second part of this chapter, which is essentially talking a little bit more about evolution. And again, in this course, in Bio 111 or Fundamentals 1, really, this is kind of the only time we really talk about evolution. It's really just introducing the concept and thinking about how important it is, but we really focus more on evolution towards the end of this course and in Fundamentals of Biology 2. Okay? So theory of evolution explains the diversity and the unity of life. And this theory of evolution suggests how all living things descended from a common ancestor. Okay, so it says common descent with modification. We can think about natural selection, all these things that I've basically already talked about. All right. Right. So there it is again. I probably talked about most of these things already. All right. So just to sort of reiterate, we should be familiar with that name there, Charles Darwin. And again, we talk about him towards the end of the semester and in Fundamentals of Biology 2. We really aren't going to focus on evolution right now. Okay. So it says here, some aspect of the environment selects which traits are more apt to be passed on to the next generation. Again, there is some sort of something genetic change, right? Some change in the genes that then provides a more favorable trait for that organism or organisms, and those are the ones that will then thrive in that environment and thus reproduce. Okay, and so that's what this is then kind of saying here, to go a little further, that then we increase the frequency of those favorable traits in the population, again, because it makes that organism more suited for the environment, okay, more fit for the environment. So we can think about survival of the fittest, right, or natural selection. Okay, these are, again, probably all terms or phrases we've heard about before. Okay, and again, down here, I already said this too. It says mutations fuel natural selection. Okay, when we say a mutation, that just means a genetic change. Okay, so that means there is some sort of random genetic change that happens, that occurs first. And then if that genetic change or that mutation makes that organism more suited for the environment or more fit for the environment, then that organism is going to be more likely to survive and then reproduce. And then that genetic change is going to be then carried on from generation to generation. Okay. And so it says here, in terms of mutations in general, introduces variation in the population. Okay. And so variation within a population is good. Okay. Again, that sort of provides the means of natural selection. Sorry. Okay. Now, this is something we can talk about a little bit more if we're sort of not grasping or understanding that concept in terms of this statement, right? So, like, look, this is something that I could probably ask you about in the exam too, right? What's meant by this statement? Mutations fuel natural selection. So, in your own words, tell me what that means. Okay. All right, so this is giving me an example, a pretty simple example, right, of natural selection. Okay, and so it's showing you here a deer, right, and some leaves. So it says some plants within a population exhibit variation in leaf structure. Okay, meaning they have these kind of spiny little hairy leaves. Okay, so there is some sort of genetic change that basically caused some plants to produce these hairy leaves. Okay. And so it says here, deer prefer a diet of those smooth leaves over the hairy leaves. Okay. And so over time, what do you notice happening is that you see more of these plants with hairy leaves start to basically occupy that area. Okay. So it says plants with hairy leaves reproduce more than other plants in the population. Why? The hairy leaves is giving the plant an advantage, right? The hairy leaves is making the plant more suited for its environment, because what's in its environment? These deer that eat its leaves. Obviously, the plant doesn't want the deer to eat its leaves, because ultimately that can lead to damage of the plant, and then ultimately for the plant to die. Okay, so it says here, generations later, most plants within the population have hairy leaves, and because these smooth leaves are selected against. The hairy leaves are selected for, right, by the environment, and the smooth leaves are selected against. Okay, so that's an example of natural selection. Again, if we were live, I might say, all right, why don't you guys kind of turn to your neighbor or get yourself into a group of two and talk about another example of natural selection, right? Write down another example of natural selection that you can think of, right? And again, so if you sat and kind of thought about it, you might be able to come up with one or two examples. All right. Okay. This is, again, we're sort of introducing this sort of concept of evolution. And when we talk about evolution, and again, when we do this next semester and we really focus on, taxonomy and the different types of species and groups of species that exist, or groups of organisms that exist, we look at a lot of these evolutionary trees. Okay. And so it says it's like a family tree. It traces the ancestry of life on Earth basically back to a common ancestor. Okay, so right, if we go all the way over here, it's showing you here, this is just one single common ancestor, this first cell that was produced. All life now was derived at some point from this one cell. And so you can see this common ancestor and how all of these branches or different groups of organisms branch off from this one common path. Okay. And so what this is showing you here is bacteria, right? Archaea. And then as you sort of move down here, you see that this cell here had a nucleus, right? So then now you're talking about eukaryotic cells. And so this is eukarya here. And all of these groups here are part of this domain, eukarya. Okay, so there are three main domains, and we're going to talk about that in a second. I think I have another slide that points that out, but just to point it out right now, three main domains, okay? Bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. All right, and again, these are all different groups or kingdoms essentially that are part of the domain eukarya. Now, at one point, and again, I probably make this point several times and maybe more during fundamentals of biology too, but taxonomy, right? This is just showing you some basic kind of large groups of organisms, but the idea of classifying and categorizing living things, that science is called taxonomy. It's ever changing. Okay. So I'll sort of continue on that. We have a little bit more about this. So let's kind of move on from here. All right. This is the same thing. I don't know why I have this again. Should have got rid of it. Okay. So like I was just saying, taxonomy, okay, is basically the classification of organisms. Okay. So it says it identifies, names, and classifies organisms according to certain rules. So a lot of how we categorize or how scientists might categorize animals has to do with what they look like, but also has to do with, physical traits, but also behavioral traits and other molecular traits and things like that. Again, this is something that we talk about in more detail next semester or at the end of this semester, okay, or at the end of this course, but also in fundamentals of biology too. Systematics is another branch of biology where basically scientists study the evolutionary relationships between organisms, and you sort of need to kind of have these two disciplines sort of come together to really classify and set up these evolutionary trees like we were just looking at. Okay, so if we talk about those classification categories that are used, okay, here they are. And so what this is showing you is from least inclusive to most inclusive, meaning the largest grouping, right, or category to this sort of smallest, right? So a single species, and then you have several species that are members of a genus, right? Then several genus that are members of a family, right? Again, order, class, phylum, kingdom, and domain. And so what I just showed you in that last slide here, right? These are the three main domains. And so one of the points I was kind of trying to make is that at one point we didn't even categorize living things in domains. We just had the kingdoms, okay? But now we added domains. And so the way we group organisms is ever changing, okay? So like if you guys teach biology, I don't know, in 10 years, right? Maybe these groups would change, okay? I mean, and so it's something that does change. I don't know, I don't want to say a lot, but it's something that's sort of ever changing as we learn more um, about different species. As new species, as we discover new species, right? We have to then sort of change the way things are categorized sometimes. Okay, so it says each successive category above species, right, includes more types of organisms than the preceding one. So that's what we mean by least inclusive, meaning it's just one single species, to most inclusive, right? In a domain, you have millions of species, okay? All right. And so if you look at these levels of classification in a table form, it's showing you here, right? And then also give me an example. So that's kind of helpful. I am not going to, ask you to memorize any of this, though again, you would have access to this anyway, so it wouldn't be memorizing. But nobody would need to memorize exactly. Like I wouldn't ask you, tell me what the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species is for corn. Okay. Memorizing these things is not something I would ever ask you to do. Okay. But you can kind of see, just give me an example here. Both human and corn are members of domain Eukarya. Okay. Domain Eukarya is all eukaryotic organisms. Okay. But then they differ once you get to kingdom. Okay. So human, obviously, kingdom Animalia, corn, kingdom plant. Okay. Or Plantae. So again, you can see how these differ. All right. Okay, so I kind of started talking about this a little bit. If we talk about these domains, so I just mentioned domain eukarya, right? So these are eukaryotes or eukaryotic cells. So any organism in domain eukarya, right, is a eukaryote, okay? Whether it's a unicellular, just a single cell, single eukaryotic cell, or it's multicellular, it doesn't matter. As long as it's a eukaryotic cell, meaning the cells contain a membrane-bound nucleus and also other membrane-bound organelles. They're going to be part of domain eukarya, okay? Domain archaea is a specific type of unicellular prokaryotes. And these guys actually are prokaryotes or prokaryotic cells that don't have a membrane-bound nucleus. They really don't have the same complex membrane-bound organelles that eukaryotes have. They're more simple. But in domain eukarya, these are particularly prokaryotes that live in extreme environments. So there are certain archaea that live in hot springs. There's certain archaea that live in the Great Salt Lake, right? Areas where there's super high levels of salt, where basically other organisms couldn't survive. Okay. Another domain bacteria, pretty self-explanatory, contains bacteria, okay? Unicellular prokaryotes that live in all environments, right? So if we think about bacteria, we have lots and lots of different types of bacteria that live on our skin, that live in our body, in our mouths, right? In our intestines. We also have lots of bacteria that are just around the environment that can cause disease, okay? These are all members of that domain. So both domain archaea and domain bacteria are not broken down any further. Okay, so archaea fit into domain archaea. There's no kingdoms or anything like that. There's different species and different, but they're not broken down like domain eukarya, right? So domain eukarya is broken down, right, into these different kingdoms. So protists, this is showing you kingdom protista, right? Protists, fungi, plants, and animals. And then again, each one of these kingdoms is broken down even further. Okay. So if I go back here, sorry. Again, here's domain archaea. Gives you some, again, basically just went over these on the last slide in terms of what members of this domain are like, right? What are some of their characteristics? Okay. We don't talk about domain archaea very much because they don't affect us that much, right? They live in these extreme environments. They don't cause disease. They're not part of our of the human body in terms of helping with processes like digestion or anything like that. And so we really don't talk about them that much, right? Domain bacteria, we talk about a lot, right? So give me an example here of E. coli. I'm sure we've heard about them, those types of bacteria before, and giving you some characteristics of organisms in domain bacteria. And then again, eukarya, like I mentioned already. Okay, so at this point, within this course, we want to know these three main domains. We want to know what type of organisms are part of these three main domains. Okay, and we just went over that. All right. Okay, so I also mentioned this as well. So this is showing you kingdoms here. Again, kingdoms, different kingdoms that fit under domain eukarya. Okay. This is kind of a little misleading here. This domain, it says protists composed of several kingdoms. Actually, for protists, they sort of reclassified these or used another grouping called a supergroup. Okay, so I don't know, sort of ignore this composed of several kingdoms. If we talk about domain eukarya, let's think about these different kingdoms: protists, fungi, plant, and animal, okay, as being part of domain eukarya. But again, you can see that archaea and bacteria do not get broken down even further. Okay, there really are no kingdoms, and so it's saying these designations are being determined. So like I said, in 10 years, maybe you'll see different kingdoms of archaea and different kingdoms of bacteria. Okay, maybe there'll be another kingdom under eukarya, right? So classification or the way we classify these is sort of ever evolving and ever changing. All right. In terms of naming, right? If we talk about names of species, okay, the naming that taxonomists use is universal. It's Latin based, and it's something called a binomial nomenclature. Okay, a two-part name. So the first word is the genus, right? And it's always capitalized. The second word is the species designation, okay, which is written in lowercase. Okay. Both words are italicized. So this is the proper way, scientific name of naming something scientifically. So I showed you the example before in that table, right, of corn and also humans. Okay, so if we talk about the species, right, essentially this is the genus and the species, right? So Homo sapiens. Genus is capitalized. Sapiens is a species, and it's written in lowercase. The whole word is in italics. Okay. Corn, zea, maize. Again, you can see the same thing there. Again, genus and species. So, I could on the exam, put a word up there, a species, or a scientific name, and say which one is the genus and which one is the species, right? So we should be able to point that out. Okay, so finally, for the last part of this chapter, a little introduction to the scientific method. I think like I said, I usually do, a little bit of sort of a class activity on this, and I will do that with you guys as well, either during our live meeting or, I don't know, as sort of an assignment, and then we talk about it later on. So anyway, sort of be on the lookout of that. I'll sort of introduce that when we meet. But we want to be familiar with the process of science, right? Or what is the scientific method, okay? And so it says here, it's a standard series of steps used in gaining new knowledge through research, okay? And I will tell you, obviously I'm a scientist. I still work as a neuroscientist at the Veterans Hospital in East Orange, and even though we may not talk about as scientists, these specific steps in the scientific method, we are always following them. It's just something that's sort of understood, and it's not that we would particularly sort of specifically talk about the scientific method, but we are always following that, right? And so if you're going to do science properly and get results that are going to be believable and reproducible, it's important that you do follow the scientific method, okay? So there are scientists out there that don't, and maybe their science isn't as good as others, okay? So this is something that is important to understand. All right. So in terms of how we're going to divide up the scientific method, right? 5 steps. So it says observation. Okay. So again, you can just again, we'll talk a little bit about this a little bit more. But I mean, observations are just anything you might observe in the environment, or if you're talking about in the lab setting and you're culturing cells, something that you might observe in your cell culture, right? Or if you're a microbiologist and you're working with bacteria in the lab, something you might observe with those bacteria, right? Anything like that, okay? And then from those observations, right, you may make a hypothesis, okay? Then some predictions and experiments, and then obviously you would then collect the data and you would have to analyze that data with statistics and then draw some sort of conclusion. Okay, so pretty, kind of seems pretty simple. I don't really like this slide, to be honest. I probably should take it out. I think every year I say, I probably should take it out. I think you look at it and you're like, what? But if you look at it a little more closely, it does sort of make sense. This is basically showing you, hey, you made some observations. You then developed a couple different hypotheses based on those observations, right? You made a prediction. You then conducted an experiment to test the hypothesis, or sort of test to see if your prediction was right. And then from those experiments, you ended up rejecting this hypothesis 1. All right, now you've got 2 hypotheses remaining. You come up with a prediction for one of those, do the experiment. Based on that experiment, maybe now you reject hypothesis 2, and now you're moving on to 3. And then again, you have some predictions from that, several experiments that were carried out, and then you basically confirmed some of your predictions. In this case, you'll draw some sort of conclusion, right? And then maybe publish that, okay? And so you can kind of see how this can be a little more complex than sort of what might have, what we sort of outlined here, all right? This is not a figure I would put on the exam and ask you to explain, because I think it's sort of a little, it's a little confusing, but anyway, so don't focus your time on this figure. Okay, so let's talk about those steps in the scientific method that we just outlined. Okay, this is definitely something you should, be familiar with in terms of the steps to the scientific method. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more. One other thing I just remembered before we sort of get into this a little bit more, in terms of the chapter 1 homework, I drew your attention already to 2 of the questions. The third question asks, how does natural selection result in adaptation to the environment? Okay, we talked about that for a while, so I hope we can answer that. If you have a question about that, let me know. All right, so moving on. So in terms of talking about these steps a little bit further, right? So observation, it says scientists use their senses to gather information about a phenomenon or natural event. I already gave you sort of examples of observations, okay? And again, I'm sure you guys can come up with a whole bunch more on your own, okay? Then from those observations, you're going to develop a hypothesis. So what actually is a hypothesis? So it says a hypothesis is a tentative explanation for what was observed, okay? And so it says an example is the discovery of the antibiotic penicillin. So I guess we can talk a little bit about the discovery of the antibiotic penicillin, okay, and how that sort of fits in with this. So penicillin was discovered in 1928, and basically scientist named Alexander Fleming, right, was basically observing his bacterial cultures, okay? And he had a bacterial culture that actually became contaminated with a mold, right, or fungi. And so nobody wants their bacterial cultures to become contaminated, right? Because that ruins the culture, and basically you got to get rid of it. However, what he noticed is where that mold was, this mold called penicillium, where that mold was on his dish, he actually didn't see any growth of bacteria, okay? Now, again, if he wasn't carefully observing what was going on, he could have totally missed this, right? So here's one thing to sort of point out, because he could have just been like, oh crap, my culture's contaminated, I'm just gonna throw it away, right? But he did, again, he noticed, or he observed that this area where that mold was, there was no bacterial growth. Okay, and so thus penicillin was discovered, right? The penicillium, the molds, basically secreted a substance, an antibiotic that could kill the bacteria, right? And so a tentative explanation for this when he saw this was basically the mold is producing a substance that kills the bacteria, right? That was his tentative explanation. And then he did experiments to test that, okay? Um, and so that's the hypothesis. It's really, like I said, it's just a statement that explains what you observed, okay? Simple as that. And so the other thing it points out here is something called inductive reasoning. So it says, in terms of what inductive reasoning is, it occurs whenever a person uses creative thinking to combine isolated facts into a cohesive whole. Okay? So it's basically the scientist is observing certain things in the environment and then puts them together to come up with a statement or an explanation. Okay? And that's sort of how you can sort of develop a hypothesis. All right, so I hope that example of the discovery of penicillin helps in terms of what a hypothesis is and how hypothesis or developing a hypothesis fits in with observations. Also, why it is so important to be, to observe what you're doing and to carefully observe what's going on, in a lab or anywhere for that matter, as a scientist. Okay. Now, again, once you develop that hypothesis, then you can conduct experiments, right? Make a prediction and conduct an experiment in terms of your hypothesis, right? So for that hypothesis, if we stick on our antibiotic sort of theme here, right? The hypothesis could be, again, the mold secreted a substance that kills bacteria, okay? So then your prediction might be, well, wherever there's molds, or if I take that substance and I put it on bacteria, it will cause those bacteria to die, right? That sort of would be the prediction. You then can develop experiments to test that, okay? To test that hypothesis to sort of see if your prediction is correct, okay? And so that's what this is saying here. An experiment is a series of procedures designed to test a hypothesis. Now, it mentions here now deductive reasoning, okay? So it says deductive reasoning involves if-then logic, okay? So if this happens, then it means this, okay? So that's sort of the sort of prediction. That's how you're developing that prediction. I will say I'm not gonna get hung up on what inductive reasoning means and what deductive reasoning means. I just want you to understand what it means to make a hypothesis, what is meant by a prediction, and what an experiment is, and all these sort of things that we're talking about. I just wanted to kind of bring up the inductive and deductive reasoning just because those words are on the slide here, so I didn't want to skip them over. Okay. This is the manner in which a scientist conducts an experiment is called the experimental design. Okay. And so there are good experimental designs and there are poor experimental designs. Okay. You still see those, if you read literature or, you see or observe or talk about other people's work. Sometimes there's poor experimental design, right? Okay, so if we're talking about good experimental design, which is what we should be talking about, it ensures that a scientist is examining the contribution of a specific factor, right? Which is called the experimental or the independent variable, okay? And so that's what's being tested, okay? So it would be super important if we're going to go back to our penicillin thing, it would be super important that when that experiment is set up, you need to make sure that the only thing that could be causing the bacteria to die is that secretion from the mold, right? There can't be something else in the environment that could be a factor as well. So you have to carefully design your experiments so that you're only testing that one variable that you're interested in, okay? All right. So if we continue with experiments, it says a test group is exposed to that experimental variable. Okay, so the test group in our penicillin experiment would be bacteria on a plate that's exposed to the mold, right? Or that's exposed to whatever was secreted from the mold. Okay, the control group would be bacteria that maybe would be treated with some other agent, right? Or they're untreated. okay? And then you can compare the growth in the bacterial plate that didn't have the molds to the one that did, okay? So the test group is exposed to that experimental variable. The control group goes through everything else, but is not exposed to that experimental variable. Okay. If the control and the test groups show the same results, the hypothesis is not supported, right? Hopefully that sort of makes sense. And like I said, we're going to go through some examples of this, and I'll give you an example, and then ask you guys to come up with some examples, all right? In terms of data, what are the data? The results of the experiment, okay? It says they should be observable and objective, obviously. So that's important when you're designing your experiment, to make sure the data you're going to get is observable. It's also something that you can easily quantify, right? And determine something that's going to be, it says objective there, right? It has to be something that, again, is quantifiable and objective in terms of when you're actually assessing that experiment to see what the effects of your experimental variable were, okay? Okay, in terms of how do you present that data, or how do you put that data together, you use tables, you use graphs. You also have to, like I said before, analyze that data using statistics. Again, that's why math and science always will go hand in hand. This is one of the main reasons. And there's obviously lots of branches of science that are very math, that involve math. Sort of in general, again, if you think about computer modeling or things like that, obviously math is always involved. If you just talk about sort of straight biological research in biology, always need to use statistics to analyze your results, okay? It says measures of variation like standard error, and then also you would need to determine if something is statistically significant. The standard error and this probability value they fit under the statistics part of it. Am I going to ask you about this? No, that's way beyond the scope of this class. But just to make you guys aware, it is necessary always to do statistics, right? To determine how different your experimental group is compared to your control group, okay? Or if they're different at all. The only way you can do that is by using statistics, okay? All right. So this is just showing you an example, obviously, of a graph, right? And presentation of some scientific data. And what it's showing you here, and it's not really a good example, to be honest, because this is just showing you some random error bars that basically Excel throws in there, and they're all the same at each data point. These standard errors would be different, okay? So what this is showing you is basically, this is just showing you these standard error bars that you might see on a graph when you look at some scientific data. And then it's also showing you the presentation of this data in a line graph form, right? So this is blood cholesterol, and this is over weeks. Okay, so I guess you could think of somebody on a cholesterol drug, right? And looking at the effects of blood cholesterol over time. Okay? Okay, so that's essentially what it's showing you there. And so you can kind of see, you started off at, what is this? 150, I don't know, 175, I don't know, what's about around 185 or something like that. And then at the end, after week 4, you're down to like 175. But you can see there was some sort of an increase and then a decrease back down. Okay, so that's what this is showing you. I didn't really give you much context in terms of what the study was, but I don't think it's really necessary at this point. Again, this is just meant to sort of show you or give you an example of a way scientific data might be presented. Okay. There are, again, many other examples. I could pull up some articles, journal articles right now and show you different examples. But again, sort of beyond the scope of this class, it's just meant to just give you an example. Okay. And then in terms of conclusion, right? So now you made some observations, you made a hypothesis, you then designed an experiment to test your hypothesis. You got your data, you analyzed it, you put it all together, and from that, you're going to interpret that data and come up with some sort of conclusion, okay? Was the hypothesis supported or not? What does that mean, right? Why is it important? You're going to think about all of these things. What should we do next, right? So it says here, if the prediction that you made, basically before doing the experiment happened, your hypothesis is supported. If not, the hypothesis is rejected. If we again go back to our penicillin example, when you put that penicillium on the bacteria, if that bacteria didn't grow, your hypothesis was supported. If that bacteria still grew, the hypothesis would be rejected, right? Okay. Then once you have a good conclusion, right, your data are sound, it's something that's super important to get out there, you would then publish it in a scientific journal, okay? And you don't just simply send it to the journal and they just print it up. It gets reviewed by your peers, meaning other scientists in your field who are usually not very nice, or they're very critical, right? And they basically send you back a letter saying, oh, well, here are all these things that you did wrong, and here are the things that we think you should change before you can publish it in our journal. Okay, so it's a very rigorous process. So that's why we say you have to publish in a peer-reviewed journal. It means, again, other scientists in your field reviewed your work before it was able to be published. So it's not like just putting something up on Wikipedia where anyone can put anything up. Okay, that's not how it works. All right. It says here, other scientists then attempt to duplicate or dismiss the published findings, meaning once they're published, now other scientists can read about it and then design their experiments accordingly, okay? And so if your data is then replicated, right, it continues to strengthen it, okay? All right, so these are just some examples of peer-reviewed journals, science being one that's a very high impact journal, right? So if you get a paper published in Science, then that's pretty good. You should probably, tap yourself on the back. All right. In terms of, you do experiments, you put that data together, you come up with conclusions. Like I said, it gets published and then people may replicate those findings. Now, there are some findings that basically are very important and they get replicated over time. And and then you can sort of join some of these concepts together to form a theory. Okay, so it says concepts that join together two or more well-supported and related hypotheses. Again, these hypotheses have to be supported many times, or have to, and there has to be lots and lots of data out there, right, and published data from many different labs before something could even think about becoming a theory. Okay. And so that's what this is sort of telling you here. Then you can then have something, be a scientific principle, okay? And so a scientific principle or a law is a widely accepted set of theories, okay? And basically there have not, and basically will not be many challenges to the validity of these, okay? So these are principles that are pretty much known, okay? So some examples of some theories, right? Cell theory, homeostasis theory, and also the theory of evolution, okay? These concepts or theories have been shown or proven. We never really use the word proven, but have been shown in many different ways, utilizing many different types of experimental approaches, and they're basically well accepted within the scientific community, okay? All right. So this is just kind of one example here of another example of a sort of experiment, okay, and sort of an illustration of that scientific method. And it may be a little hard to see, but I'm just going to leave it like this. Sometimes I'll sort of manipulate this to kind of make it bigger here, but I think we can read it. So it says here, state hypothesis. Antibiotic B is a better treatment for ulcers than antibiotic A. And again, this hypothesis, think about this. This is some clinician, right? A clinician that does clinical research, right? That may have noticed this in his patients, that antibiotic B seemed to be a better treatment for ulcers than antibiotic A, okay? Therefore, then there was an experiment that was performed. Groups were treated with the same except as noted. So, okay, so these are patients that had ulcers. Some received a placebo, some received antibiotic A, and some received antibiotic B, okay? Then, so patients had ulcers. They were given these three different treatments, either placebo, antibiotic A, or antibiotic B. And then basically each subject was examined for the presence of these ulcers to see basically what sort of happened over time on that treatment. And then the data was collected, and what do we see here, right? In terms of this is effectiveness of the treatment, okay? In terms of the higher the percentage, the more effective the treatment is. And so, one second here. I just want to see what here. Yeah. Okay, so they did this, just in case you're wondering. I just have to sort of look it up because I forget what they actually did here, and it actually shows you in the picture, right? They did an endoscopy. Basically, you're basically sliding a camera down the esophagus, right, to look at those ulcers to basically determine, basically determine what those ulcers look like after those treatment. Okay. So anyway, what they basically found, and again, if we go by here, that the higher the percentage here, meaning that indicates a higher effectiveness of treatment. Okay, so that's what this graph says. In terms of exactly what the measure is, I don't really know, and it's not really outlined specifically, so it doesn't really matter. We're just going to go with the higher the percentage, the more effective the treatment. Okay, so if we look at this graph, I'm sure we can determine which treatment was the most effective, right? That would be this here, okay, which had this 80% test group 2, which was the group that received antibiotic B. So based on this experiment, antibiotic B is a better treatment option than antibiotic A, and obviously way better than the placebo. Okay. All right. Oh, maybe it tells us what the actual graph means. I don't think so though. All right, so I already went through this. Okay. So it's saying here, newly discovered antibiotic B is a better treatment for ulcers than antibiotic A, which was currently in use. So again, this clinician wanted to determine, well, I want to know if antibiotic B is really a better treatment, and if I should switch my patients and give them antibiotic B instead of antibiotic A. All right, we already went through all this. Basically, just went through everything here. This just clarifies a little bit in terms of what that endoscopy is. I kind of already said that. All right, we already went through that. All right, so those couple slides just basically describe or go through what we went through in that picture. All right. Okay, so that was just an example of essentially the scientific method, right? An example of an experimental design there. Okay, you had 3 groups in that experimental design. I might ask you, I could put something like this up on the exam and say, all right, I wouldn't tell you that this was a controlled group, but I would say 1 received placebo, 1 antibiotic A, 1 antibiotic B. What is the control group? Okay, so we should be able to point these things out. Okay, last part of this, again, is sort of something that I just go over really quickly. This is something that does change. I mean, I guess we can think about one really big challenge facing science right now, obviously, is COVID, right? Something that, essentially you would never really predict. And actually, one of the categories here is talk about emerging diseases. Okay, so there you go. I mean, this is just mentioning several diseases that have been in the news, right? H5N1, these are different flu viruses, right? SARS, Ebola. Well, now when this book is published again, the new version, COVID is going to be on there. Okay, all right, so let's go back. All right, so it says challenges facing science. So it says technology is the application of scientific knowledge to the interests of humans. Science is a systematic way of acquiring knowledge about the natural world, right? We probably, again, know these things as well. And so this is just giving you some examples of technology, right? Okay. And so again, this is probably something we can think about on our own. Some other types of new technologies, scientific technologies in particular. I guess probably every technology is technically scientific, right? It gives you an example there. Cell phone, new drug. I'm sure, again, you could think of some others. And so if we were in class, I would ask you guys to give me some examples. All right, we move on. So one thing that is a challenge that faces science, and something that, again, continues to challenge us, is habitat loss and basically the loss of diversity, right? The loss of biodiversity. So we should know these terms. And so biodiversity is basically the total number and the relative abundance of species. Okay. It says the variability of their genes and the ecosystem in which they live. So meaning, if you decrease biodiversity, you're decreasing ecosystems in which these species live in. You're basically then in the process decreasing the total number of species that exist. Okay. You're then, by decreasing the species, you're decreasing the variability of genes in a given ecosystem. Okay. And so it says here that in terms of how many different species exist right now, it says estimated to be as high as 15 million species that exist. Now, when we talk about decreases in biodiversity, that number then would be decreasing, okay? But, I mean, I guess if you're thinking about loss of biodiversity, right, you'd be decreasing species. But in fact, I guess it's estimated that we really don't know all the species that exist. We're still identifying species, okay? So I guess there's some estimation where basically basically only about 2 million have been named and identified, and that we may have as many as 15 million species out there, okay? So in terms of job security, right? Taxonomists probably have really good job security. If there's still 13 million species to identify, they need a lot of taxonomists, right? And scientists to be able to identify these different species. So anyway, the idea though is that we see this loss of biodiversity. Again, we obviously there's a lot of species that still exist, but we have been seeing a decline in the number of species. All right, extinction. I'm sure we know what extinction is. So, death of the last member of a species. And so it says estimates of that 400 species a day are lost due to human activities. Okay, so that's a lot. And so, just to sort of illustrate this point, if you look at the coral reefs, you can see this. Okay, so this is showing you a healthy coral reef. Now, coral is a living organism. And so you can see lots of diversity in terms of the different types of corals that exist here. Also in terms of the different types of fish populations, and then also other plant life as well, okay? And so lots of biodiversity, right? Lots of different species that exist there. These species all, play a part in that ecosystem, okay? And again, due to certain human activities, we can see basically death that sort of occurred over time at the coral reef. And so here, if you look at 1975, shows minimal coral death. You still see some, although I think maybe this isn't the greatest picture, but anyway, you still see some coral, you still see some colorful fish around, but definitely doesn't look like this. If we move further through, you can see I don't see any fish in this picture here, right? And then it's getting worse. And worse. Okay, so you can see some bleaching, right? That's occurred of that coral reef. And so again, what happens here, the biodiversity that once existed in this ecosystem is essentially gone, right? Tropical rainforest is another type of ecosystem that's in danger. And so obviously these are ecosystems that are very diverse, okay? And so if these get destroyed, we're basically losing a lot of different types of species in the process. All right, so again, we talked about coral reefs already. In terms of tropical rainforest, the canopy of the rainforest supports orchids, insects, monkeys, many other organisms, and a lot of the plants that live in the tropical rainforest are, plants that we can actually extract medicines from, okay? And these are plants that don't really exist or are able to live in any other habitat, okay? And so if these tropical rainforests go away, we're going to lose the ability to extract medicines like that, okay? And again, in terms of diversity of animal life, there's a ton of it as well. All right, so we talked about coral reefs. Again, it says to provide habitats for jellyfish, sponges, crabs, lobsters, right? A whole bunch of different types of aquatic life. All right. So in terms of, what we depend on healthy ecosystems for, right? I mentioned medicines, food, raw materials. If you think about, obviously trees, right? In terms of raw materials for building and things like that. Um, it says here too, if we talk about changes in the ecosystem, right? Draining of the wetlands of the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. When that happened, basically worsened flooding. That flooding then ruined farmland. And so again, you can see how destruction of a certain ecosystem then has these sort of downstream effects. Okay. Again, destruction of the South American rainforest killed certain species, decreased the availability of lumber. All right. Um, I mentioned this right at the beginning just to kind of put into perspective. Again, emerging diseases. Several diseases that have been in the news over the last decade. Again, add COVID to the list. Okay. Where do they come from? Who knows, right? I think there's still a question in terms of where COVID came from. It says new or increased exposure to insects or animals. A lot of times, these diseases are carried by different vectors, right? It could be a mosquito or a certain type of fly, what have you, but not all the time. Changes in behaviors, use of technology, right? So Legionnaire's disease was basically spread around through the air conditioning system of a hotel, and if that air conditioning system wasn't there, it wouldn't have been spread that way. And again, I think we're gonna, if we as we learn more about COVID-19, I'm sure there's, a lot of these things come into play in terms of why it came about, right? Um, so it says here pathogens mutating and changing hosts. Okay. Again, COVID-19 could have just came up just again based on sort of natural selection or mutation that occurred that caused this virus to become a lot more virulent than other strains, right? But most likely it sort of involves a combination of several of these, right? So you can kind of think about these things in terms of um, how that comes into play um, to this pandemic, right? Because we're sort of living it right now. And so I think obviously it's of greater interest of us and to us. And I think it's something to kind of think about to put these sort of concepts together, right? And so definitely sort of interesting to think about. Globalization. If COVID really did come from China, I think we're pretty sure that that's where it did started. That where it started. Well, again, if we didn't have globalization and it wasn't so easy to travel from China to the United States, well, maybe it would never have made it here, right? So again, all of these things come into play or are responsible for these emerging diseases. All right, and so um, this is the last slide. Talk about climate change is another sort of challenge facing science. I think we hear about climate change a lot, although I don't think we've heard about it much lately because we've only heard about COVID lately. But but basically, um, you know, climate change, you can think of it as changes in normal cycles of the Earth's climate, right? And a lot of climate change can be attributed to human activities. And so it says more carbon, right? If you think about chemical cycling of carbon, right? More carbon is being released than removed. If you think about burning of fossil fuels, right? Releasing a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. Destruction of forests, so that we lose the ability of taking in that carbon from the atmosphere, right? And so we have this increase in carbon dioxide, and that then can lead to climate change, okay? And so, I mean, I guess you could talk a whole lot about climate change, right? We could talk a whole lot about emergent diseases right now as well. All right. So this is again, that's again beyond the scope of this class, but it's just, this chapter is really just meant to introduce these concepts, right? And to get us sort of thinking about these things. And these are things that we'll come back to. And that is finally the end of the lecture. Thanks, guys.